Thanks very much for joining this climate change discussion. It's great to see so many people attending, and I look forward to adding to the conversation with really this important topic. I wanted to start off with an acknowledgement and appreciation that the land on which we gather and reference in this webinar is the converging traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx, Secwepemc, Syilx people, Colville tribe, as well as the Métis people whose footsteps have also marked these lands. So I'm really excited to have the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium present this session as I feel are leaders in determining and reporting on climate change projections for the BC and the Yukon. They base their information on the science and have spent a lot of time developing these user-friendly tools to help us stay informed. And I'm looking forward to seeing a bit about some of these tools later on in the presentation here. I have been using the PCIC climate change information for years through my schooling as a consultant and here in government. And the PCIC analysis is relied on really across the board by many different institutions. It's a go-to for the climate change information. Certainly I've been seeing that for the years. The goal of this webinar is to provide an overview of climate change. So looking at some of the regional projections and boundary specific information, we're really happy to have Kari Tyler and Trevor Murdoch, both from the PCIC, joining us here today. And so some of you have received their short bio, but for those that you didn't, I just want to say, so Kari Tyler here is a user engagement and training specialist at PCIC Impacts Consortium. She's a resilient and adaptation expert with a master's in adult education and community development. Her work experience includes designing climate change resilience and adaptation programs. I know it's something that we're certainly important part of what we need in this area, and is a leading planning process for different levels of government research and humanitarian organizations. Trevor Murdoch, who we also have here today, is climate scientist with, again, PCIC, leads a regional climate impacts theme and has spent over 20 years working on applied climate science to assist decision-making and planning. So I'm gonna let Kari speak to a little bit about the presentation and sort of how the layout's gonna happen and how that's gonna, so how they're gonna work together on that side of it, duties between her and Trevor. So a few housekeeping rules for this webinar. So as an attendee, you're going to be muted. We are able to open up release your muting at the end of the presentation if we need to, but there's also a lot of other ways of trying to ask questions or engaging with the group here. So you're welcome to ask questions through the presentation in that Q&A button. So hopefully everyone can see that at that bottom banner at the bottom of your screen there. It's that Q&A. And with this, Trevor and I are going to be looking at the questions as they're coming through, and we're going to be answering them as we're able to. If they're specific to the presenter, know that the presenter is going to be dealing with it at the end of the presentation. So just keeping that in mind. There might be some that get left and you're like, hey, how come they're not being answered? That's probably because we think it's more suitable for the presenter to be able to respond to some of those ones. If there's any issues with the webinar, such as you can't hear me because I'm muted, please just feel free to use the chat, and we'll certainly be watching that as well. So we're gonna be able to stop or be able to comment on any of those, address those issues quite quickly. So the session is being recorded, and if you'd like a copy of the recording, feel free to email me at watershedplanner@rdkb.com, and I will forward one through. Maybe too large, I may need a USB stick, but we'll see how it goes. So before we start, I just wanted to find out a little bit more about the people that we have online, the presenters. So we pulled together a couple of polls for you. And once they've gone through the polls, yeah, we'll give you a quick look at the answers. So hopefully you're seeing a poll in front of you. It's just gonna speak to where are you from? So, it's a couple of questions in there. Great, we've got some people coming in already on the poll. So I'll give it a few minutes here and yeah, we'll sort of see the general idea of where people are coming in from. So we've got 20 attendees and we have 10 people written up the post. I'll give it a few more minutes and we'll see if we can pick up any more people. All right. Oh, go ahead, Carrie.
Oh, I think, yeah, we've got a couple of things in the chat. I'm glad to see people using those. Oh, interesting. So someone's saying the poll won't let us finish if we aren't from the boundary. So we'll just have to answer the first question and we'll see how all that goes when you share the results, once that's the point.
Oh, that's a great point. Oh, well, now it looks like I needed to have the word other in there as one of my options. So great. You know what I'm going to do then? I'll end the poll shortly here. Okay, so I'm going to end it up. And so there we are. 82% are within the boundary region. So we've got 18 plus or minus, because it sounds like we're having a bit of a problem with if you answered no to that, to be able to move through. But pretty interesting. Village of Midway, City of Grand Forks, so that's been really great. All right, well, let's see. And the one other question we've got in here for the poll is, what's your knowledge on the climate change? So have you had those discussions before with people? Are you familiar with climate change? So what do people think about their general knowledge on climate change? So it's nice that we've got a fairly solid representation of that boundary region. So that's been really good. I know that I've had a lot of interest, a lot of emails coming through. I've got a couple more people that are just putting in their 2 bits on the knowledge. 5 more seconds and then I'll shut her off. Great. So there we are, share results. And so most people have some understanding. So that's great. So this is going to be, yeah, looking forward, Kari and Trevor, to some adding to that side of the discussion. Well, on that, I'll pass it over. Thank you very much.
All right. So just to double check as we get started that you're seeing my title page slide and not the one with the notes. I don't have much in the way of notes, but okay, just a nod or thumbs up. Thank you, Trevor.
Yeah, it sounds like we are.
Okay, great. All right, so again, my name is Kari Tyler, and Trevor and I work at the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, which is a climate research institute that is physically located at UVic. So we are being beamed into your day today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen, Esquimalt, and Saanich people. And I certainly find myself reflecting, especially in these challenging and dramatically changing times, just reflecting on how grateful I am to be here and how much gratitude I have for the stewardship of the Indigenous people that continues into this day, and their community leadership as well. So a little bit about PCIC. I think you can see the slide here. It's got 3 major theme groups. The Regional Climate Impacts Group is the one that Trevor and I work at, and he's the lead of that group. We also have a research group that works on hydrological impacts, and a climate analysis and monitoring team as well. And all of us are supported very capably by a computational support group, which does all of the essential work to support the computer services and to make all of the tools that we have available online. And they're really the muscle that makes a lot of our work go. So getting started here today. So today is a 90-minute session. So I can totally do time. We're going till 3. But that's broken up. This first hour is sort of an introduction to climate change. And we're going to stop and have time for questions and some discussion once I'm done this first chunk of slides. And if you have had it at that point, feel free to sort of exit from the Zoom meeting. And in the last 30 minutes, we're going to do what's probably going to feel like a dizzyingly quick introduction to some of PKIC's online climate tools. So if that appeals to you, please stick around for that. But I did just want to, we did intentionally break this up into the two pieces so that you can choose what level of engagement you want here. So just to go over with this presentation, we're going to have a lot of maps and plots and a few graphs. Most of those are in the second part and part two, a handful of photos. There are no cartoons for you today, sadly. If you didn't find any of the nutrition facts slide here at all entertaining, then that humor quota is off. I'm grateful to have you with us on Zoom and on the phone because I know that there's a lot of time spent sitting in front of computers these days and wrestling with webinar and Zoom and conference call connections. So the other thing I'm going to say is that actually the way that I have my screen set up right now, I can't see the chat and the Q&A functions. So I'm relying on Trevor and Christina. If there's something that comes up that I need to do differently, they will verbally interrupt. They'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. Trevor is likely to participate in any of the discussion. I'm totally good if we have, I think it's important to ask questions as they come up to you. So feel free to do that in the chat or the Q&A. If you have specific questions for me or for Trevor, I would, if you can figure out the Q&A and put them in there, I would really appreciate those going in there, because that way if we don't get to it right away and multiple people have the same question, you can upvote questions. And sometimes that's really helpful for kind of taking a pulse of where people are at and what's kind of like a burning issue on your mind. So that's just a quick reminder on using the Zoom engagement. And now I'm going to continue with the basics. So to begin with, when we're talking about climate change, we kind of have to understand what climate is. And that starts with a refresher that is as much a reminder of what you already know. I'm quite certain you understand that weather is the conditions at a specific location and time, and climate is the long-term statistics of weather. I have borrowed from a New York Times article that I saw once that so weather is about what you choose to wear at any given day, for example, and climate is about what the range of options you have available in your closet. And if you, like me, are now looking for summer clothes and trying to remember where exactly you stashed them, that's a good sort of comparison. So one quick point, we have an example. Trevor was actually at a meeting in Montreal on December 2nd in 2005, and he phoned home to talk to his family. And in one of those locations on that day, it was 6 degrees and snowing. And in the other location, it was 19 degrees and sunny. So again, this is Montreal and phoning back to Victoria. So take a moment to just kind of guess which place you think was 6 degrees and snowy and which place you think was warm. And I'm just going to jump right ahead to that answer there. And so on this particular day in December 2nd, 2005, it was actually snowing in Victoria, and it was quite warm and sunny in Montreal. But if you think about climate as that long-term statistics, and, you know, again, I said in one of those locations, Victoria or Montreal, for the average temperature for December for a 30-year period from 1971 to 2000, the average temperature would be about 4 degrees, and there'd be some snow. And then the other location, the average temperature would be -6 degrees, and there'd be quite a bit more snow. I don't think anyone would have any challenges figuring out which of those averages is Victoria and which is Montreal. So of course, Montreal in general, way more snow, much colder than Victoria, though that particular day in December, Montreal was warmer. So part of what that gets to is that climate varies by location and with time. So I'm going to run through a couple of examples of seasons where we have these variation in the weather and climate experience depending on where you are. So in the winter of 2014 and 2015, the planet as a whole, this is so interesting, was about half a degree warmer than this baseline temperature of the historical temperature from 1970 to 2000. But if you notice in BC where there's a star, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if you can't, I am circling the little star. And so this winter, at this point in 2014, 2015, BC was one of the spaces where it was warm. But this was a year where there was, the eastern seaboard was cold, and there was newspaper articles about things like Snowmageddon. So that's a year where there was a senator in Washington, D.C., who went outside and got a ball of snow, carried the snow inside and said, it's cold outside, where is the global warming? And at that exact moment in time, the planet as a whole was experiencing on average half a degree warmer than historical norm temperature. So again, this is about the same amount, a little bit less, same amount of, very close to the same amount of warning for summer. So this is June, July, August of 2010. This is a time when Europe was experiencing a really dramatic heat wave. There was news coverage about loss of life in Europe during this heat wave. And at this point, BC was cooler than normal. It was actually quite a cool summer here. And then this photo is from forest fires in Siberia as well, which was experiencing some very extreme heat. And in 2003, again, planet as a whole was about 4 degrees warmer than the historical average. BC was also quite hot. Europe was extremely hot. And you may remember the summer of 2003. It's notable for a lot of folks. This was the year of the Kelowna wildfires. So it's important to note that temperature, the increasing temperature, isn't sort of a linear and direct cause of forest fires, but it's certainly a strong contributor. With the heat, of course, it's far more likely that with evapotranspiration that it will be a lot drier and things like that. So it's a good indicator of the potential for an increased risk of forest fires. So going back, so we started with the examples from when the planet as a whole was warmer than average. Now we're going back into time to the winter in 1970s. So this is actually a time when the planet as a whole was about 0.4 degrees lower than that 30-year mean. So it's colder then, which makes sense, right at the beginning of the 70s. And it was quite a cold winter in BC. And because we had a really cold winter, there was a really big snowpack, and this was actually a time when there was a record flooding in Prince George, which is where this photo is from in the spring. So the spring breakup brought with it a lot of flooding. So thinking about that, keeping that sort of variability in mind in space, and also in time. We'll talk about that a little bit right now. So first we're going to talk about the historical average annual temperature in BC. So this is this gray line. The variability in this picture is the band of pale gray around the black line there. And when we're transitioning from the history to talking about future climate, one of the things that's always a fun touch point is to reflect on the challenges of predicting the future. And so just take a moment in your head to choose who you think this quote is from. And then I will share what the internet, all the different people that this quote has been attributed to on the internet. So, you know, we're not even super clear who said this first and who to give credit to. So to talk about future climate, we work with climate models, which are sort of complex computer models that look at the atmosphere, break it down into these grid cells, and then calculate future temperature pathways. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, you've probably heard already about different Either you've heard about RCBs or you've heard about the IPCC, or maybe you've heard about the Paris commitments. A lot of when people talk about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, this is about the global impacts of greenhouse gas emissions. And there's kind of an infinite amount of possibility for the future. But to sort of make decision-making manageable, we've broken down these sort of 3 scenarios that we work with. And so the red line is the high emission scenario. The blue line is the low emission scenario. Those are kind of they are probably pretty reasonable approximations of the outside limits of possibility. That blue line is the scenario that would correspond with global warming being limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so this is what that would look like in BC. This is, again, the average annual temperature. So when we want to be thinking about variability, you can just remember a normal bell curve in terms of statistics. And if you think about the past, this gray area, there's hot years where with peaks and cool years with the valleys, and those hot years in the historical record would correspond to some of the examples I gave before, like 2003 was a hotter than normal year, so it's a peak. In the 1970s, we had colder than normal years. We've had lots of valleys, so those peaks would correspond with years where there'd be a high snowpack and sometimes flooding in the spring. And so you can kind of keep your own stories and your own memories of what hot and that cold and how different those two are, and the dramatic impacts they would have on the landscape. And if we think about climate projections through the course of the century, and if the planet as a whole follows the pathway of the high emission scenario, which is RCP 8.5, one of the things that we should be aware of is that annual average temperature in BC by the end of the century will be so different that we are effectively in a different place. That the average annual temperature of the coldest years, that would be so cold that they would have dramatic impacts on the landscape, would actually be warmer than the hottest years of our historical past. So this is talking about a really big range of possibility. And that is hard to kind of wrap your head around and hard to kind of define a space for decision making if we're looking at that end of century, that really big swath. So what do we do to make this manageable and useful, and what information is good? What's a good place to do decision making? So we focus on the RCP 8.5 for the 2050s when we are providing information with partners. We can run all of these projections, but through engagement with partners and decision makers, what we've kind of come up with is proposing looking at this red line for the 2050s, because, again, let me see if I can do this. If you draw a line out, ta-da, I think, so if we look at the red line for the 2050s and you go out to the 2070s, that is sort of corresponds with that yellow line, sort of that middle scenario, which is RCP 4.5. So by planning for RCP 8.5 for the 2050s, we can also just kind of, and if we have a lower emissions inevitability as a planet, then we can just kind of be a little bit more prepared for that other temperature scenario. So I think I'm going to erase. No, I did not. Let me try this. Erasing. Good. All right. Because now I move forward. All right, so one of the challenges, though, is that a lot of our decision making as it stands is based on the historical record. So there's a, I'm just gonna show you the mouse. I think I figured this out. Over here, there's this horizontal black line. that corresponds to the historical record that would be used to inform decision-making for things like the BC Buildings Code. And there's a lot of other things besides the building code that we use historical weather information and historical climate information to inform our decisions. And that practice has worked for humanity for a long time when the climate was stable. But when we're talking about a climate that is changing, and changing rapidly and changing for all of the foreseeable future, we do need new ways of making decisions. And I'll come back to that concept again later. But in terms of changes in temperature, how does that kind of play out in BC? For most regions in BC, including in the Kootenay boundary, this means that there's warmer winter temperatures. It's more likely to get extremely hot in the summer, and with that increase in heat, it also means that you have a corresponding sort of increase in dry spells because available water will evaporate faster as it gets hotter. There's more, the precipitation patterns change. And one of the things to keep in mind about precipitation patterns changing is the increase in intensity and frequency of extreme rainfall, in part because as the atmosphere warms and holds more water, we're getting more extreme storms. So when it rains, you're more likely to get these dumps of extreme rain. And I'll come back to that in a second with some of these maps. So I have a series of projections for the region here that I'm going to go through. And part of the exercise in looking at things is also to think about what these changes would mean for areas of your life or your responsibility for work, or just think about what kinds of impacts this will have on the landscape or on plants and animals and agriculture, things that you're familiar with, and some of that thinking about what this means is an important part of the work that you do, and what you do with climate projections is stuff that is not necessarily our expertise, but we can talk to you about how climate is changing. So the first thing is that there's going to be fewer frost days. So what you're seeing here is the change in frost days from the historical baseline period from 1970 to 2000 for a projection that RCP 8.5 for mid-century for the 2050s. And in the Kootenay boundary here, you see that there is spatial variation in how many fewer frost days, but that in the valley bottoms here, we can be talking about 2 months fewer frost days, which is a big seasonal shift. So frost days then are being that's days where the maximum temperature is below 0. One of the other big shifts is in the minimum temperature. So this is the nighttime lows in the spring. This has big impacts on sort of spring snowpack, which in turn, of course, has big impacts on summer water supply in a watershed. So again, for our baseline, the 1970s to 2000 baseline, you can see here how cold it got. This is a measure of what the temperature was, and how often it was below 0 is in the blues. No, not how often, sorry, it's how much below 0 is in the blues. And the seasonal minimum temperature by mid-century, the averages then get in that 0 to 4 degrees by the 2050s, which means that things aren't staying frozen overnight as often. There's also going to be an increase in the summer hot days or extremely hot days. Everybody experienced extremely hot slightly differently. So this is a measure of summer days over 25 degrees Celsius, and then this is just the change again from the historical past to the 2050s. We have an increase here of about a month in a lot of places. Again, more in valley bottoms, fewer in cooler parts of the region already. And I'd mentioned frequency and intensity of wet days. So this is a comparison, again, between the past and the 2050s of the amount of water falling in an extreme precipitation event. So it's a 95th percentile precip event. And so this is just talking about when you have a lot of rain falling, there's more rain falling over the course of the century. The last thing that I wanted to mention, this is from our hydrological impacts group. And this is where, this is the Columbia River at the Bonneville Dam, which I realize is not in the region, but it sort of captures some of the cumulative downscale sort of impacts of some of the watershed. And if you look at the hydrograph here, you see that over the course of the century, so the historical baseline here is in black, the 2050s is in green, and the 2080s is in red. There's this shift in available in the stream flow, so that there's higher stream flow in winter, there's a lower and earlier peak, and a lower flow in summer as well. Now, and sort of the upstream impacts of this, we don't have a lot. I was looking for some hydrographs, and we don't have much available directly in your region. But one of the things that to keep in mind, again, is the impact of snow on water supply in the basin. So whether it's a snow dominant watershed or a rainfall dominant watershed, and sometimes there's analysis that can be done to see it sort of at what point that shifts. It can have big impacts in available stream flow. It takes a little bit more research than we have time to go through today. But one of the things that I wanted to just sort of loop back after looking at those projections is to think about what this means for decision making. And again, I'm using the building code as an example because it's quite tangible. We can figure out what we can compare the past to the future, but it also applies to a lot of other decisions. So when you think, when you think about the building code as it stands now, or many different government decision-making mechanisms that just kind of are built on the assumption of a static climate, there's this historical sort of amount of variability that is expected. And one of the things to notice is that right now, our current climate is already significantly different from our historical climate. So there's already more variability, a wider range of conditions to consider. But if we're doing planning for the coming century, if we're making decisions that will have an impact for 20, 30, or 50 years into the future, we have to consider this much broader range of design and climate parameters. And there's a bunch then of the climate information or climate parameters from the past that are already not serving us well, that are not necessarily relevant. And so there's consequences to how we act, and there's some awareness that we just want to sort of leave you with. I'll get into this in a little bit more nuance again in a second. But the main things to take away is that the past is not a good guide for the future, that the past is already not representative of the present. And so decision-making mechanisms that rely solely on past information for climate are inadequate. And then looking to the future, it's important to notice that conditions will keep changing through the century and beyond, in all but the best case. It's only the blue line there that kind of stabilizes by end of century. And so therefore, in planning decisions that have impacts that play out over the course of decades, you have to accommodate a wider range of climate conditions. And then also remember that if you are using data from the RCP 8.5, that red line for the 2050s, that's roughly equivalent to the yellow line, that optimistic scenario for the 2070s. These things all together mean that as community leaders, as resource managers, as citizens who engage with government, we have to be thinking about our climate context a little bit differently. And this required some major mindset shifts. The first is that stationarity is dead. And I think, well, I mean, I think even COVID is sort of bringing this mindset shift to the forward. There is no new normal. Sometimes when people are talking about climate change, they'll talk about the new normal, but a really important concept is that it's only the best case scenario where global greenhouse gas emissions are limited quickly that the climate stabilizes. And it's only that scenario where you can talk about a new normal. And so as a result, we have to plan for resilience. What does that mean when there's so much that's uncertain? How do you navigate that uncertainty? The tools to navigate uncertainty are often described in terms of resilience, a systems-based resilience approach. And that's a whole body of work and study. And I'm not going to get into in detail right now, but if you're curious about it, I encourage you to look it up. And I think the other thing that's important is that these changes can be an incredible opportunity. That as we start thinking about the ways that we have assumed a static climate or assumed static anything, that the assumption that what has happened before is just the way it's going to continue kind of locks us into patterns of behavior and decision-making that may never have served us well. And in the climate change adaptation field, there's a lot of lessons that we have learned about adaptation and how to build resilience and how to take action to kind of understand and integrate future climate information. So part of it is just to use that future climate information, build a team, work on the knowledge that you have and your own understanding of your local environment, embed the use of future climate information into processes, apply resilience principles. Because there's so much uncertainty and because this change is continuing, there is no one right answer. And so we have to try things out. We have to build teams of people who have different skill sets and are creative, and we need to get outside of our silos and collaborate, and we have to take action and revisit processes. Iteration is going to be key for building resilience and key for managing an uncertain future. And what that means is really just trying things with the expectation that you're going to adjust course again. And so responding to the realities of climate change means in a lot of ways that we have a lifetime of learning ahead of us. Changes are going to come and changes are going to interact. And so one of PKIC's roles is to provide information about different climate projections, and we have some tools for that I will get into after we've answered a bunch of questions. But one of the things that I really want to leave you with is that it's really not about answers in the short term, but about equipping yourself for ongoing learning to start somewhere and then continue learning about future climate and continue learning about ways that that future climate will impact you. Here's my email and our website. And I am going to just pause in the sharing and move to the chat and questions and kind of turn the microphone over to Trevor or Christina to sum anything up.
I think that was great, Kari. Unless I'm doing the chat wrong, I think you have, everyone was just entranced with the presentation. I don't see any questions. Maybe people were waiting to get unmuted and want to do things verbally. We'll see. So
we did have one question that was, can you describe the RCP? So
okay, I guess I didn't see that somehow. Okay.
Oh, okay. So I'm just making sure I'm screen sharing, but I have stopped. So let's see the RCPs. Let's go back here. Where did that thing go? Here we go. Well, whatever. Okay. Nope. Oh, this is going to be annoying. Let's try this again. RCPs here. I swear there was a play from here button. There we go. I think this is right. Okay. And if you have other questions, please add them to the Q&A and the chat button. And I don't know what's up with my Zoom showing. I can't see the chat. So anyway.
I see.
I
was following the chat, not the Q&A. I see these are two separate things. Okay, I'm learning.
All right. So the RCPs, feel free again to add more or comment in terms of what the RCPs are, and I think you're probably, let's try switching this. There we go. So that should be bigger for you if I've got this right. So the RCP 8.5 is this red line. This is the higher emission scenario. So in this image, what we're showing is average annual temperature in BC. But often when people are talking about, when you see the media or hear the media talking about climate change, you'll hear, global warming of 2 degrees or limiting global warming below 2 degrees or things like that. The 2 to 4 degrees of global warming is talking about the planet as a whole. And one of the key concepts right at the beginning to understand is that BC, Canada as a whole, warms about twice as much as the global average. And so does BC as a province. So we've got this historical baseline around 0, 2 degrees of warming from that historical baseline is sort of the first line. And if we have the high emission scenario, we're talking about warming in BC that's about 6 degrees. So that's talking about how that global warming has an impact on the average annual temperature in BC. So that is really significant in terms of environmental, just in terms of the way that will change our whole climate system, will really shift it. And so RCP 8.5 is the higher emission scenario. RCP 4.5 is kind of the middle of the road. It roughly corresponds to, RCP 4.5 roughly corresponds to what the global emissions would be if all the countries that signed on to the Paris Commitment and submitted plans actually did those plans. However, even the plans that countries submitted as part of these international agreements don't add up to what was the stated goal, which is that what you call sort of that Paris goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the blue line corresponds to global greenhouse and a global greenhouse emissions pathway that is roughly sort of corresponds close-ish to that 1.5 degrees of warming. Yeah, I don't know, Trevor, do you want to add anything, or is there anything else coming on there about RCPs?
No, I mean, I think the question was really just about what does it stand for, but in the absence of other questions, I think that was a great, further detail on that. The only other thing I might add is that since you're showing that now. Yeah, as you pointed out when you were presenting, the blue line, this is the so maybe two things I would add about this. To get to that blue line, this is the one when you hear people talking about getting to net zero in a decade or maybe in 2 decades. That getting to a net zero emissions and then staying at net zero emissions. And to do that, that does involve some technologies don't quite exist, so that's a pretty aspirational. It's sucking some carbon out of the atmosphere, plus that sort of transformative change into really replacing things that we do that produce greenhouse gas emissions, replacing them with non-fossil fuel sources. So that's that sort of rapid sort of aggressive emission reduction. There's some debate around whether it's really possible. You know, as you mentioned, those kind of the red and blue sort of encapsulate the range of possibilities. There's some debate around whether the red is impossibly pessimistic and whether the blue is impossibly optimistic, but they're pretty close to the outer limits. The only other thing I would also just mention about that blue line is you mentioned, Kari, that that's the only one that has a new normal because it flattens out towards the end of the century. But even that new normal, that's where the, you know, around 2050 or 2060, yeah, that's a completely different climate from our historical climate. So everything Kari was saying about, you know, any planning that relies on historical design conditions alone is still unsuited to the future. That still holds even under this sort of most optimistic scenario, which is a very long-winded way of saying we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions if we want to be on this lower curve, but we're going to need to adapt and figure out how to plan for a future climate, even in that best case scenario of reducing emissions.
And I thought I would take this opportunity to test the drawing tools on Zoom. So if anyone has any questions in which I should draw things, also feel free to pipe up with those.
So I have a question. So let's say in the last, say, 10 years, how are we doing for the emissions outputs? Are we showing that reduction, that minor? Are we meeting?
Yeah, not great. We're roughly tracking something like if there was an RCP 7.6, I think, okay, if I remember correctly. Although it's a little bit of a red herring because how we're doing so far is less important. Like these are just 3 different possible scenarios. But actually, if you look real close on the blue line, you can see that the blue line tracks higher than the yellow line for a while. So where we are in the early part of the century doesn't really matter so much as where we end up, if that makes any sense. So if, for example, if we were using fossil fuels investing them in ways of getting off of fossil fuels, we'd have a higher emissions for a while and end up better off. We're not expert on the policy side, the harder side of getting humans to change their behavior. Although maybe we can take some lessons from Dr. Bonnie Henry, the public health officers. They're able to get people to change what they do pretty rapidly. So if we had that kind of authority, I think we could get onto that blue line. But
yeah. So I mean, the biggest thing is because we don't know what, and it's not just what BC or what Canada does, it's what the planet is capable of as a whole. And so, I mean, my feeling is that the pragmatic approach is to plan for a significant amount of change, and how much change to plan for depends on the risk tolerance of any particular situation. So it's the, you know, if you're building a bridge that provides access to, is the only way in and the only way out of a community, you want to make sure that that is for sure going to make it for the next 70 years. So then you want to plan for sort of a more extreme range. If you're making a decision that just has an impact in the next decade, and in the shorter term, these scenarios are all quite bunched up together. So, you know, it doesn't really matter. It matters less if you're looking at a short-term decision, which RCP you choose for getting data. And yeah, they have the biggest impact, sort of diverging at the end of the century there. So are there any more questions or comments in the chat? I think I can see the chat now. It just won't let me do anything like scroll up or down. Oh, here we go. Okay, and I don't know where the Q&A is. There's no open questions.
Yeah, I don't see anything else in the chat or open questions. So unless,
Perfect.
Christine, unless you wanted to open it up to mics, I guess we'd move on to the tools section.
Yeah. Yeah, as I was saying, if anybody wants to raise their hand, if they feel that they want to be able to vocalize their questions, by all means, let me know. And oh, look at this, I've got a hand raised. So what I'll do is, all right, I will push on. So Kathy, I believe I have unmuted you. No, just try to.
I think it's a two-step process. I think you can invite Kathleen to unmute herself.
Oh.
And then she has to like confirm it or something.
This is the joys of working with some of the new systems. So you know what? It's interesting because it's not letting me unmute you. It's allowing me to click the box, Kathy. And unfortunately, it's not letting me do it. So I apologize. But if you want to email me your question, I can certainly read it out at that side too, if that works for you. Sorry about that.
Or type it in the chat or.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't have any other questions. But yeah, this was great. Thank you very much, Kari.
Very welcome. All right, I am gonna figure out how to get to still screen sharing the second part of this one.
And just before you start, while you're getting that set up, if anyone does have any questions about the tools while Kari is presenting, I'm now actually watching both the chat box and the Q&A box now that I know that those are two different boxes. So I will answer questions as you have them this time for this part.
Okay. So I am having my own adventures and not being able to find the play slideshow from current location button in my PowerPoint. So yay. We will get the speed version. Here we go. So we're going to do a quick run through of two of PKIC's climate tools. The first is Plan to Adapt, which has just been updated, and the second is the Climate Explorer. Feel free to play along at home by checking out the Plan to Adapt tool. It's a much simpler and more user-friendly tool than Climate Explorer. Climate Explorer is really sort of designed for researchers and people who are familiar with climate data to begin with, because it's got a lot of things that you have to, there's a lot of, you can sort of choose your own adventure in a great more detail with the Climate Explorer. So Plan to Adapt is sort of a tool that is really designed if you have 5 minutes and you want to know some things about climate change, and some like starting points, or maybe having some questions or conversations with other people in your region. Plan to Adapt is sort of a good place to start. So you can choose from predefined regions that are regional districts, health authorities, and eco provinces. And then you can also select the time period that you're looking at, the 2020s, the 2050s, or the 2080s. To select your climatology. And so when you do that, you, so here I've done sort of a screenshot of an example of selecting for the Kootenay boundary for the 2050s. And then this is the summary tab that you would see. The Plan to Adapt has a more limited number of variables than Climate Explorer, and it doesn't have extremes. So this is talking about the average temperature, the averages in precipitation, snowfall derived from temperature and precipitation, and growing degree days, heating degree days, and frost-free days. are all things that you can look at. So you can get this information in the summary table. The important thing about the summary table is also to look at that range. Right now, Plan to Adapt is working from a 1960 to 1990 baseline, which is what the older version was also using. That might change. We're expecting that will change. If you go to the Maps tab, this is looking at frost-free days. You can use this to generate some of your own images for the change in the region of frost-free days, as an example. There's a bunch of different variables you can look at: the frost-free days, growing degree days, heating degree days, precipitation, snow, and temperature again. And you can get maps for different seasonal data as well as the annual aggregate data. So I do suggest that you just kind of poke around and play around and see what strikes you. One of the pieces of advice that I give to people when they're first looking at climate data is to look at it a bunch of different ways. We don't have the graphs feature up quite yet. It's just being refined. But when that's up, I think it's a good exercise to look at both maps and graphs, because there's things that will strike you about the nature of the change differently, just depending on how the data is presented. And also check out the impacts tab, which I didn't take a screenshot of, but the intent of that is that for different sectors and different impacts, there's just some sort of like starting points for discussion to just reflect on how these changes or changes of this significance will have different impacts in different industries and agriculture. And it's not about giving answers again, it's about just kind of posing questions or starting points, or giving people a place to start to think about climate impacts. So the Climate Explorer, well, actually I'll just stop there with Plan to Adapt. So that was really quick, and so I hope that if you've got computer access, you're just kind of poking around. But if you have any questions about Plan to Adapt, you can get those into the Q&A or the chat. And if we have time at the end, which we may very well do, I can also go through a live walkthrough or answer some questions by going to the Plan to Adapt website, or Trevor can do that, because he could queue that up while I'm still yammering away here. So if you have questions, please do put those in the chat or the Q&A. But now I will talk a little bit about Climate Explorer.
So I have a quick question. So for the Plan to Adapt, and you may have said that at the beginning, which is the the emission standards that you're using for Plan to Adapt, and why?
Good point. So part of what Plan to Adapt has, that is a really good point. I think this is our RCP. It's an ensemble. That's a good point. Trevor, do you remember what Plan to Adapt? It used to be a combination of...
Yeah, we separated them out. I think, yeah, it's just 8.5 only. Just 8.5. So the intention is that this is the simple to use tool. So if you want to explore the other emission scenarios, then Climate Explorer is better suited to that. And as Kari mentioned in the presentation portion, the RCP 8.5 2050s is basically the same amount of climate change as 4.5, 20 years later. So that tends to be the one that's most focused on. And that's also why, by the way, 2050s is the default. When you go there, you'll see a summary table, and there's some options. You can look at 2020s and 2080s, but the default is 2050s.
Yeah. Looking at the 2020s is always interesting as well, because we are in 2020, and so it is still a projection, because we don't have a 30-year climatology yet for this time period, because there's not enough years that have passed. But it's a really interesting thing to compare again to the historical baseline, just as a sense of how much climate has approximately already changed. And that can still be important. Or it could be important for sort of shorter term agricultural planning to look at the 2020s. Shorter term, by which I mean like a decade, rather than multiple decades. So with the Climate Explorer, you define your own region, you choose your own time period, you choose your own baseline, you choose your RCP, you also can choose your climate models. There are some variables that have been calculated with Ensemble. So Ensemble means it's a word for a group of climate calculations that for a group of climate models, and that's what I've got for an example, because using ensembles is best practice. But there are some variables where they don't have the like PCIC 4, PCIC 12 calculations complete, and then you have to sort of select a representative group of models, and then do your own calculations to figure out what those all mean. So this is a little bit more labor intensive. It's a little bit more work to make meaning out of the results that you see for the Climate Explorer. There are some videos. The videos linked on this landing page that I'm highlighting here are they're about a year old already, and the site is continuously improved and the tool is continuously updated. So there's now a lot more databases and a few more features that are on the tool, but these videos are really helpful for getting a place to start. So the first thing that this tool can do is that you can pick your own area. So this is a box that I drew. You don't have to make your box a box shape. You can make a polygon. The other thing that I selected here is the model. This is an ensemble model of 12 global climate models. This is the PCIC 12. I then selected the emission scenario, so to do a comparison between the historical and RCP 8.5, but there's a bunch of different options there. And then the variable that we're looking at is the 50-year annual maximum one-day precipitation amount. So it's an extreme precipitation variable. There's a lot of different extreme precipitation variables, but this is like a 50-year return period, one-day precipitation event. I also had cleared the climate raster layer, and then when we zoom in, this is the image of the results for this location, and for the changes in climate. I've got an arrow here, so just to show a graph of the long-term averages in this annual variable in this part of BC. This one isn't in the Kootenay boundary. This is just an example that I had done before, because and what I've done here is taken a bunch of screenshots, because it's actually the tool. There's actually a lot going on the page. If you go into the tool and poke around, there's more information than this on a page. So I'm just trying to kind of focus in on a couple of the features to help them make sense to you, or this is my hope anyway. So this is zooming in, looking at that long-term average. You can hover on these graphs over them, and at any point where there's a dot, you can actually get the results. So this is an example in another part of BC about how with extreme precipitation events, the amount of rainfall that occurs in those events is increasing over time. So because the Climate Explorer, you can choose a bunch of these different models. So each of these lines is the results from a climate model. This particular one that we're looking at is the ensemble. So it's that blue line, and it should kind of line up in the middle. But this is kind of a good visual example to see that if you had chosen some of those other climate models, you would have gotten results. These different lines would have shown your results for the same level of inquiry. And this also illustrates why you need to use multiple models for getting results, because of the inherent uncertainties in both in the future and the different approaches and the different ways that climate models do their calculation, which are sometimes referred to, I think, Trevor, that this is what they're referred to in terms of biases. Is that the right sort of way of describing different approaches in climate models? Trevor.
Yeah, sorry, it takes me a second to get back to unmute when I'm watching the screen. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that without going way too far into the weeds. I mean, the short answer is different climate models treat different aspects of the climate system differently. So they'll take different approaches, especially to things that they have to parameterize so basically things that happen at a finer scale spatial resolution than the climate models can resolve. And there's sort of no correct known answer to these things. So you'll make different sort of arbitrary choices about them.
Yeah.
So there's climate model uncertainty, but the other aspect is natural variability, right? Mm-hmm. So and both of these, one is uncertainty, climate model uncertainty, but the other is just like a natural feature of the climate system. Mm-hmm. And both of those things are going on in the differences between these two.
Right. So one of the really important things is there isn't one model that is right or better or best for BC or best for the inquiry that you have, and that it's really important to kind of to understand the spread of the different model contexts. So the Climate Explorer kind of opens up the hood a little bit on that, and that you can see the different model contexts and sort of the results from the different models. But also that can be a lot if that's not what you're interested in. So that's sort of why Plan to Adapt is a good place to start and a good place to kind of get your feet wet, and that the Climate Explorer might be more of a tool for more technical deep dive or a site-specific analysis. And even then, I work with engineers who will have very specific questions that they want to bring to the Climate Explorer. And because of the way that each sector subject matter expert kind of would frame the questions they would have about climate change, there's still a little bit of a gap between what people want to know and what climate models can actually do. And for those reasons that Trevor mentioned, the combination of natural variability and climate model uncertainty, that gap in a lot of ways is irreconcilable. There is no, and the nature of the future, which is just inherently uncertain, there is no one right answer for some future climate data endpoint. We can have a single right answer for something that happened in the past because we have a record of what happened at a particular place at a particular time. But in the future, some of that uncertainty is just sort of inherent in the fact that, you know, it hasn't happened, so we don't have a record. Anyway, so that's one thing to just be aware of in working with climate data, is that there's no shortcuts around having to think about your own context and think about and bring all of your own expertise to bear on whatever data that you're looking at from either the Climate Explorer or Plan to Adapt. So yeah, that was a lot of long-windedness about the climate model. So this variable that we're just doing this example of here is an annual variable. So there's no seasonal variation. There's other variables that you can look at on the Climate Explorer where you would have seasonal variability, and that would show up in this tab in the sort of the seasonal change in baseline. But the other thing that shows up here again is if you were in the Explorer and you hovered over this one at any particular point, you can see both the seasonal average results through all these different decadal periods. So you can interact with the graphs here. there's more information in the Climate Explorer. There's different summary tables. You can, the data sets that you pull, you can change your baselines. Anyway, there's a bunch of different things that you can do. So this is a different precipitation indicator. This is where you get some of the seasonal variation here, just as, again, a different way of looking at data outputs because it's a different indicator. Then this isn't your region in BC, so it's probably not super pertinent to you. This is just sort of an example of the kinds of things that can be done with the Climate Explorer. And then all of this data is downloadable. There's that export data button, and you can take snapshots of the images or you can download the data. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to bore anyone too much with a deep dive in the tools. So this was just a really shallow walkthrough, and we're happy to take questions. If you have anything in particular for Trevor or I or Christina, we can try again with the unmuting. It's always worth a shot. In the presentation, which I think will be sent out to you in PDF, there's also a lot of resources that are attached. We have PKIC has worked with regional districts, a variety of different regional districts, to do regional analysis. So actually I can show you some of these. And with the BC Agriculture and Food Climate Action Initiative. So there's a report for the Kootenay boundary for the BC Agriculture and Food Climate Action Initiative. And then there's these other regional districts and health authority reports that kind of, reading them, if you were interested in learning more, it kind of gives you a sense of all the different indicators and variables that were looked at, and then what was found to be salient by the users in that area, and a little bit, it might give a little bit of insight into the back and forth that has to happen to get sort of from the climate data to making meaning of the climate data, and what considerations there might be in terms of policy or program development or things like that. And I didn't include on this list the Okanagan, all three of the Okanagan regional districts, but they all, when did we do that? In the before times, we did, I think in the fall, we did a regional assessment with them as well. So.
Thank you very much. I think so I've got a question in terms of, like, if somebody's doing a project and they're trying to figure out, let's say they're hoping this thing is still going to be around for 80 years. So they're trying to understand, maybe what are the big concerns that they're going to have to watch for. Let's say we go under your minimum emissions reduction grouping. So should they just go to the plan to adapt and be able to look at, so you've got an average in there, and then you've got your plus or minuses on either side. So what would they use? And the other question would be, is what about an engineer? So when an engineer is having to do engineering construction, you've sort of said that they get to pick based off what they're hoping to see. How do people figure out? And I guess third is what happens when I get to speak. What are some of the big things that we're looking for in the boundary region? Like, what are we looking for in terms of that change in, let's say, it sounds like 2050 is very similar to all the different standards, but maybe the 2050. Okay, I'm done.
All right, I can start, and then I'll have Trevor jump in for the things that I've missed. So let me just try and summarize. So where to start with a project? What do engineers do? If I knew the answer to that, man. Anyway, if I had a simple answer to what is the single best advice, the only thing that engineers need to know, but I'll wade into that. And then sort of what are some of the big changes in the Kootenay boundary. So I think the where to start, my suggestion is to start with plan to adapt, and then ask yourself for each variable, you know, what am I seeing and what does this mean, right? So for the Kootenay boundary, I guess I can go back to this one so that you guys can see it. I'm not sharing my screen right now, right? But then you can't see. What is this? Okay. I'll just, if you go back and wait, nope, this one, summary screen. So if you look at the summary that would just come up for the Kootenay boundary on plan to adapt, my recommendation is to look at the range and say, well, if average annual temperatures are 4.4 degrees warmer than the baseline, what does that mean for me? An average annual temperature is actually really hard to kind of wrap your head around because it's not an extreme, and I couldn't tell you what the average annual temperature was like anywhere that I've lived. Oh, maybe Victoria now, because I referred to it in this PowerPoint presentation, but only for December. I could tell you that the average annual temperature in Victoria in December is 4 degrees, but I have no idea what the average annual temperature is in Victoria, so I wouldn't really know. But if you think about an average day in the summer, and if it was, again, we can, oh wait, this isn't interactive. You look at the maps in the Valley Bottoms, if an average day in the summer is 4.5 degrees warmer, what is that going to mean for, it depends what your area of responsibility is or what sort of project planning you're thinking about. What would that mean, you know, in terms of public health? What would that mean in terms of agriculture? What would that mean in terms of the forestry sector? We'll have a longer growing period. That could be good. But if precipitation patterns are changing, when does that become an issue? You know, like what are the characteristics of precipitation that become an issue? And how could I learn more about that? So I suggest people sort of go to plan to adapt as a way to begin, just to start framing follow-up questions. And the impacts tab, which I didn't actually include in this PowerPoint presentation, is kind of a starting point for some of that. The shortest answer is it depends. It depends on what you're trying to work on. But I think the really important thing is that you already have relevant expertise. In whatever area of responsibility you have, you probably have a story about an extreme event or an unusual situation, whether it was extreme heat or an extreme rainfall event that had an impact that was an issue in the area of decision making that you're thinking about. And then the question is often like, what if that happens more? Because if whatever that impact is driven by warming, like if it's driven by an increase in temperature, so and that includes extreme precipitation events, then it is probably going to happen more, because that's the clearest trend that we have. Yeah, I don't know how super helpful that is, but that's sort of a starting point, and then there's a lot of different things to get into the weeds. But one of the other points is that climate data won't tell you what to do. You have to think about, what does this climate data mean for the situation in which I am? Second question was about engineers, right? And that's exactly, it's exactly the thing. So it's quite, engineers, so I've been doing a couple of webinars with FPI, and I'll be doing more FP Innovations, which is it's kind of a forestry sector group, but they also work with engineers designing resource roads. And so the Climate Explorer can be useful for looking at a bunch of different extreme precipitation variables, and you can, part of just what that illuminates is the ways that extreme precipitation is getting more extreme, and you can put some quantification around that, but I think there's a lot that you can do when you like just know that that is changing. Yeah, so I think that's where I would start with that, but you can populate that a little bit by playing around with Climate Explorer to see how the different extreme precipitation variables are changing. And then what was the last question? I've already forgotten.
I think I was just sort of trying to get a summary of some of the things that maybe we should be looking for here in the boundary. So,
oh, the boundary, yeah.
A little bit about the changing of events and the level of intensity. You made a reference to the heating, how it can affect precipitation.
Right. So, yeah, so the things that we can produce are these images that talk about how there's going to be less cold and more heat and sort of more intense, that when it rains a lot, it's going to rain more in that a lot is going to be more wet. And then what that means in your particular geography, you know, where you are in terms of top of a valley, bottom of a valley, how close you are to moving water, how sensitive you are to heat or precipitation events. That's sort of what that's kind of what affects the what you do about it. But I think, I mean, one of the things that was interesting when we were flipping through the stuff was the spring minimum temperature. This is a big change, and in part it's because of the threshold that you're at, where you know, in the spring, the minimum temperature, so like nights in the springtime in the historical baseline, we're really just below zero on average. And they're increasing a bit by mid-century, so they'll be just above zero on average. But that couple of degrees shift from below zero to above zero makes a big difference when, if snow is your water reservoir. And so I think that's one of the things that my suspicion then, based on this image, is that difference between just below freezing and just above freezing is going to make a big difference in this region, and it'll have an impact on freeze-thaw cycles on road infrastructure. It'll have an impact in water supply and distribution, and in a lot of ways, the fall and the spring. I mean, I know we're looking at the spring numbers here. They will feel weird. Like, I know that's not a scientific kind of phrase, but it has a big impact on people, right? Like the ski season is going to be different. You know, increasingly there will be these times of year where you're like, well, I mean, should we start planting? Or it was really, gosh, that was a really warm day, but then you'll still get the cold. It's not going to be as extreme as it was, but cold still happens. And it's that flopping back and forth that I think will be hard. Yeah. Trevor, do you want to add things? I did a lot of word saying, a lot of talking there.
I mean, I think the only thing I would add is like just specifically to the question of like when you have a project. And I think this applies to engineers as well, is like in terms of which tool do you go to? You can think of it as like a screening level process. So you might want to go to plan to adapt to get kind of a quick and dirty answer for how much do you expect climate to change in your region, to help decide whether you need to do more analysis, whether you need to hire an engineering consulting firm with experience working with climate change to do a more in-depth analysis. And same thing, those engineers in turn would probably go through as this type of screening level. More and more specific and detailed information gets used only if it looks like from your early assessment that you need to keep going deeper, if that makes any sense. So even the one area that we really have some specific guidance to engineers in the province is Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure requires that future climate be considered for anything that any infrastructure that the ministry is replacing, or new projects as well. So bridges, culverts, any roads. You've got to show how you take future climate into account. And so engineers and geoscientists in BC worked with them to put out a guidance document around how to do that. And it's very iterative, and there's very much this, in an initial phase, you might just go get sort of general climate variables and general regional information, and that's enough to decide whether to go deeper. And at some point you might need to make sure, okay, is this like downscaled to exactly the area I'm interested in? And am I looking at all of the individual indices of extremes that I need to look at, or whatever. So
I'm just going to jump in because I've got one more question here that was emailed to me, and Trevor was right. I was putting some information on the chat, but I was putting it to just the panelists. So that was too bad. The question is about, what do you think in terms of the government uptake for your messaging, for the climate change messaging? Do you have any input on that? And it was talking a bit about the forestry. Are we planting enough trees? Do you see that there's been change over, let's say, the last 10 years in terms of mitigation, different practices that take this into consideration? I think, Trevor, you just spoke about the engineering, and that engineering now is required to put that climate change component in. And
I had that in mind, actually, because you had sent that question. That
just finish the last point, and then I'll mute. And it says, if you have any insight for effective collaboration with watershed members, watershed groups. So just stuff that people could do to be able to help support your messaging. Thanks.
So I think the only thing that we can really speak to from PKIC is uptake on using future climate information for planning. And I think the question is really more about how seriously is government taking reducing greenhouse gas emissions. On the uptake of information for adaptation and for planning for climate change, I think BC has been a leader. It's really more, it's not the political level that's happening at, that we're working with. That uptake has been working with a lot of people who've been at this for a decade, in the Climate Action Secretariat in particular, and the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure I mentioned actually has this requirement. I think they have been recognized as one of the first places within North America to actually require future climate to be taken into account. So so I would say BC is a leader on that front at the political level, and in terms of mitigation, it's mixed. It's certainly, we don't actually have, our mandate is to describe what the future conditions will be. So that doesn't come with a recommendation about how, what we should do to reduce emissions. But as a citizen, I can certainly say that nowhere is doing everything possible to make sure we're on that blue line. That's about, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to. In terms of for watersheds in particular, Kari, do you have anything you can, like connecting to watershed groups?
Yeah, well, sort of. I actually wanted to sort of flip back to this slide because I think there's on the right-hand side here, there's some good reminders, and then there was the mindset shifts that I think apply to watershed groups, to some different advocacy group. Like it's not direct, but I think there's things that you can kind of pull out to prioritize. So in terms of the past isn't a good guide for the future. But if you've seen things in the past that were worrisome or where there were critical failures, if there was something that happened, if there was a flood or fire in the past, and we know that temperature is going to be increasing, which has these impacts on precipitation driven flooding, and that you'll get like these big and weird kinds of storms. Then if it's happened in the past, then it is probably more likely to happen in the future, depending on where on the extreme, where it sits in terms of being a really extreme event. But in general, like I say, things that are fundamentally driven by temperature in the climate system, if it's happened, it's going to be more likely to happen. And so if you just assume that static baseline, if your guidance of, if you have that framing of it was a 1 in 20 year event or a 1 in 50 year event, so we don't have to see that again for a long time, that may not be appropriate anymore. And then the other thing is, because conditions will keep changing, if you, in your understanding of your context, again, if flooding is already an issue, or if heat is already an issue for public health, that's only going to become more of an issue. And we know enough to know that trajectory of change. And so if you know best practices for mitigating those impacts, for protecting wetlands or things like that, the case might become stronger for why those things are important. And that also ties back to sort of the concept of resilience.
So I'm just going to jump in, just because we're at 3 o'clock, and I know that this is the end of the webinar, scheduled webinar session. So if Trevor and Kari are okay sticking around for a few more minutes, if there's any more questions, that would be great. But I just wanted to quickly put out there, thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and I really appreciate it. Christina Anderson, the Watershed Planner in the RDKB, and by all means, please give me an email if you've got any questions, or there's things that it would be interesting to be able to touch on for future presentations, or really touching on the climate change discussion. So thank you, and I will let Kari, sorry, I'll let you finish your thought.
It was a good place to interject, because I think the fundamental crux of what I'm saying is that if there are already best practices that you know, or good practices that you know, to manage things that are already an issue, if climate change will make that issue worse, then that's just sort of something to include in the conversation, I guess. I think, yeah, mechanisms for doing that are not things that are sort of our space, but certainly that climate is changing is understood in government and with decision makers, but it is actually quite complicated to integrate that into all the different kinds of decisions that are being made and all the different kinds of planning that is happening. So it's a lot of work yet to be done. Okay, I think that's it for me, and I'm just sort of scrolling through the chat. I don't see anything more.
There was one more question, and I answered it just about kind of along the same lines as the last thing in terms of advocating to the Minister of Forests, Lands and Natural Resource Operations, Rural Development. Flynn has been, they were one of the early users using future climate information. They've made use of it in the seed transfer project. The ministry does make use of future climate information. It is not our role to sort of advocate on using the forest as an emissions reduction strategy. That's sort of outside of our mandate, so that's not something we've been advocating to them for.
I think you summarized it really well, Trevor, just by speaking that it is in a lot of the discussions. So it sounds like it is a lot of the discussions throughout BC. What are some of the options, you know, between your Plan to Adapt tools and the Climate Explorer tools? You've got a lot of different ways of trying to get the answers or ideas, ranges in terms of what to expect. So, you know, in terms of the government uptake, it is a bit more of a political question than science, which is sort of the focus of the webinar here. But I think the big first step is really making sure that that's at the forefront of some of these discussions. And it sounds like, you know, there's a lot of different sectors that are keeping it in mind as they're doing some of their planning. And a big one is for the private landowner to also really keep this in mind as they're doing the planning too. And it might be the type of vegetation that they plant, or it might be the permeable pavement that they're using in order to try to reduce some of that erosion and or sediment transfer. So,
yeah. The final thing that I would say, I know it's time, is just sort of on this subject, is that I think we're at a point now where there's training available for various professions and various designated professionals. So anyone who's hiring sort of a designated professional, a forester, an engineer, we're at a point where you can expect those people to understand future climate and ask that they communicate their understanding to you in a way. Now, there's wide range of capacity on that front. The training is ongoing, but it exists. And so I think that anyway, I think that's sort of another way of saying, like, as you hire someone or people who are in those positions, to say, you know, explain to me how you are taking future climate into account in your professional decision making. And we're at a point where that's a reasonable request.
Yeah, so ask the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. If there's no other questions, I know that I've had the one through the email, but I just want to thank you both very much. I really appreciate it. And it's pretty exciting to have some scientists and being able to put it more into a user-friendly and give us a bit of an idea of where to find some of the information. So thank you for your time, and yeah.
Great. Thank you to everyone who participated and was attending. I'm super shocked that there's still so many of you are still on this call, so we should let you go.
Thanks. Take care.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.